My name is Linda. I'm 25 years old. I wish I could tell you I grew up in a warm, loving family, one of those picture-perfect ones you see in movies. But my reality? It was far from that. My parents always had a clear favorite, and it wasn't me. My younger sister Emily was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Meanwhile, I was the one they overlooked, no matter how hard I tried to earn their approval. For years, I told myself that if I worked harder, achieved more, and stayed quiet, they would finally see me. But nothing I did ever seemed to measure up. Even as I pushed myself through school, landed a good job, and tried to make something of myself, their eyes never really focused on me. Not the way they did with Emily. I should have seen the signs. Looking back, it was always there. The way they would cancel plans with me to attend her dance recitals. How birthdays were an afterthought for me, but an event for her. I thought, maybe as we grew older, things would change. Maybe one day they'd look at me the way parents are supposed to look at their children, with love, with pride. But that day never came. And then, my life changed forever. It was a rainy evening, a blur of flashing lights, blaring sirens, and the cold sting of reality. I had just finished work, exhausted as usual. My boss had made me stay late again, piling on last-minute tasks like I was some kind of machine. By the time I finally clocked out, the sky was already dark, and the rain poured down in sheets. I should have called a cab. But I wanted to get home. I was tired. I was drained. I never saw the other car coming. One moment, I was driving through an intersection, and the next, a violent crash. Metal against metal. My body jerked forward, the seatbelt cutting into my chest. The world spun, and for a terrifying moment, I thought, is this how it ends? When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My head throbbed, my arm was in a cast, and my ribs ached with every breath. But I was alive. Somehow, I had survived. I should have been grateful. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. I reached for my phone, expecting a flood of worried messages. Instead, there was nothing. Not a single missed call. No texts from my parents. Not even a "how are you" from Emily. My heart sank. Maybe they didn't know. I dialed my mom's number, wincing at the pain in my wrist. It rang, and then went to voicemail. I tried my dad. Same thing. Panic gnawed at my stomach. They couldn't just ignore this, could they? It was hours before my phone finally buzzed with a message. My heart leapt until I read the words on the screen. "We're off to Rome for fun. Don't call?" I read it again and again. Disbelief washed over me, followed quickly by a hollow ache in my chest. My parents, my own parents, knew I had been in a car crash, and their response was to go on vacation? Tears burned in my eyes. I lay there, alone in that sterile hospital room, wondering how people who were supposed to love me could be so heartless. I wasn't asking for much. Just a little care, a little concern. But no, I was an afterthought, as always. And for the first time, the truth I had been trying to ignore became impossible to deny. They didn't care about me. Not really. Days passed in a blur of painkillers and physical therapy. The doctors said I was lucky. Lucky to be alive. Lucky the damage wasn't worse. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt abandoned. Not once did my parents call. Not once did Emily check in. The nurses became the closest thing to family I had during those weeks. And the more I sat there, left alone with my thoughts, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about the car crash. It was every moment leading up to it. Every time they dismissed my achievements. Every time they made me feel invisible. This was just the final blow, the one I couldn't forgive. I realized then that I had a choice. I could keep chasing after people who clearly didn't want me, or I could finally walk away. And for the first time in my life, I chose me. Leaving the hospital felt surreal. My body ached with every step, but the real pain wasn't physical. It was the sharp, aching hole in my heart. As I sat in the back of the cab, watching the city blur past, my mind replayed that text over and over. "We're off to Rome for fun. Don't call." It echoed in my head like a cruel joke. I tried to tell myself I shouldn't be surprised. After all, hadn't they always treated me like I didn't matter? But this was different. I had been lying in a hospital bed, broken and vulnerable, and the people who were supposed to care the most didn't. I arrived at my apartment, dragging my overnight bag up the stairs with one arm. My other arm, still sore from the cast removal, throbbed with every movement. As I unlocked the door, a familiar wave of loneliness hit me. The apartment was cold, empty, much like my relationship with my family. I dropped my bag and sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. I thought back to the countless times I had bent over backward to please them. Birthdays I had spent alone because they were too busy celebrating Emily. Phone calls that were ignored. Achievements that were dismissed as not a big deal. It wasn't just the crash. It was years of being second place in my own family. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. I was too tired, too numb. A part of me still hoped that maybe, just maybe, they would call, that I'd wake up to a voicemail, an apology, some sign that they cared. But days passed, and my phone stayed silent. On the fourth day, curiosity got the better of me. I opened my social media and searched for Emily's profile. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through post after post of her in Italy, laughing in front of the Colosseum, sipping wine in Florence, shopping in designer stores. My parents were right there with her, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. There was no mention of me, no sign that they even remembered what had happened. I felt something inside me break. For years I had chased their love. I had swallowed the hurt, hoping one day things would change. But this was the last straw. I wasn't going to beg for their affection anymore. I wasn't going to keep playing the role of the forgotten daughter. I decided, right then and there, I was done. But cutting ties with family isn't easy. It wasn't as simple as deleting a number. They were supposed to be my foundation, my support. And yet, every time I reached for them, I came away empty-handed. The next week, I poured myself into my work. If they weren't going to love me, I would create a life where I didn't need their approval. I worked late nights, picking up extra projects and pushing myself harder than ever. The distraction helped. For the first time, I focused on what I wanted, not on proving myself to people who didn't care. But the anger never fully faded. One night, as I sat at my desk finishing a proposal, my phone buzzed. My heart leaped. Maybe finally it was them. But when I checked the screen, it wasn't my parents. It was a text from an old college friend, Rachel. "Hey, been a while. Saw your post about your accident. Are you okay?" Her message was simple, but it hit me harder than I expected. Someone cared enough to ask. Someone who wasn't family. Tears pricked my eyes as I typed a response. We ended up talking for hours. I told her everything about the crash, about my parents, about the years of being invisible. She listened, never interrupting or minimizing my pain, and when I finished, she said something I'll never forget. "Linda, you deserve better. You deserve people who love you without conditions. Her words echoed in my mind for days. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had spent too long waiting for love that would never come. I began reconnecting with other friends I had drifted away from. It felt strange at first. After years of prioritizing my family, I realized how much I had neglected my own support system. But slowly, I rebuilt those bonds. And with each conversation, each shared laugh, I felt a little less alone. Still, my parents' silence loomed over me. Weeks turned into months, and not once did they check in. Part of me wanted to reach out, just to see if they cared. But every time I considered it, I remembered that message. "We're off to Rome for fun, don't call." They had made their priorities clear, but life, as it often does, had other plans. One morning, as I sipped my coffee and prepared for a presentation, my phone rang. My mother's name flashed across the screen. My stomach twisted with a mix of hope and dread. After all these months, why was she calling now? I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" My voice was cool, distant. "Linda," she began, her tone unusually soft. "We need to talk." I waited, heart pounding, as she explained. My father's business was struggling. A major client had pulled out, leaving them on the brink of financial collapse. They needed help, my help. I almost laughed at the irony. For years, they hadn't needed me. But now, when their perfect world was falling apart, I was suddenly important enough to call. And for once, I didn't feel desperate for their love. I felt powerful. I took a breath, steadying myself before I spoke. "I'm sorry you're struggling," I said, keeping my voice calm. "But I'm not in a position to help." There was silence on the other end, shocked perhaps that I wasn't falling over myself to fix their problems. But I didn't owe them that. Not anymore. After the call ended, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, I had set a boundary, and I wasn't going to break it. I wasn't their backup plan. I wasn't their afterthought. I was my own person, and I was finally free. Days turned into weeks, and for the first time in my life, I stopped waiting for my parents to care. Their silence, once an unbearable ache, became background noise. I poured myself into work, and slowly, my world began to shift. I had always been good at my job, organized, creative, and dependable, but something about cutting off the weight of my parents' neglect unleashed a version of myself I had never known. I was sharper, bolder. I started pitching ideas I had once been too afraid to voice. My boss took notice, giving me larger projects and eventually a significant promotion. I should have been happy, but a hollow ache still lingered. One evening, after a long day at the office, I curled up on my couch with a cup of tea. My phone buzzed with a new message. Rachel again. She had become my lifeline, checking in on me regularly, always ready with a joke or words of encouragement. "Proud of you, girl. You've come so far." Her support was like a balm to the raw parts of me. I smiled as I replied, feeling warmth replace some of the loneliness I had carried for so long. But that night, as I tried to fall asleep, memories of my parents crept back in. I wondered if they missed me, if they regretted their choices, if they even thought about me at all. I told myself I didn't care, but part of me did. A month later, life handed me an unexpected twist. My company had partnered with a major tech firm, and the project manager I would be working with was none other than my sister, Emily. When I first saw her name on the email thread, my stomach twisted. I hadn't seen or heard from her since their Italian vacation. I debated backing out, but my pride refused to let me run. I was no longer the girl they could push aside. The day of our first meeting arrived, and I made sure to dress the part, confident and unshakable. My tailored navy suit felt like armor, as I stepped into the sleek conference room. Emily walked in a moment later, all smiles and charm, just like always. But when her gaze met mine, the smile faltered. "Linda," she said, surprise flickering in her voice. "Emily." I nodded coolly, keeping my face unreadable. The meeting started, and to my satisfaction, I held my own. I laid out our strategy with ease, answering questions with the kind of authority I had earned through late nights and hard work. Emily, for all her polish, struggled to keep up. Afterward, as everyone filed out, she lingered. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice quieter now. I hesitated but nodded. We walked to a private lounge down the hall. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "I didn't know," she said softly, her usual arrogance replaced by something that almost resembled guilt. "About the accident. I didn't know how bad it was." I scoffed, folding my arms. Would it have mattered? You and Mom and Dad seemed perfectly fine sipping wine in Italy while I was lying in a hospital bed. Her face paled. I thought you were okay. Mom said you were fine. If I had known—" "You didn't ask," I cut her off. The anger I had buried for months rose to the surface. "You never asked, not once." She shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and for the first time in years it sounded genuine. I wanted to hold on to my anger, but her words cracked something inside me. For so long, I had blamed her as much as I blamed our parents. But maybe, just maybe, she was caught in their web too. "I deserved better," I said quietly, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "You did," she admitted, tears pooling in her eyes. "And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." The apology was far from enough to fix years of pain, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, working with Emily became easier. She made a real effort, checking in on me, respecting my ideas, even inviting me to lunch once in a while. For the first time, I felt like more than just her shadow. But my parents? Silence. Until, one evening, a familiar number flashed across my screen. My father. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" "Linda," he said, his voice heavier than I remembered. We need your help." I waited, my heart pounding. "Your mother's sick," he admitted, the words thick with unspoken fear. "She was diagnosed with a heart condition. The treatment is expensive and—" I cut him off. "You need money." "Yes," he said quietly. "We do." For years I had dreamed of this moment, the day they would come to me, needing something only I could give. I thought I'd feel vindicated, triumphant. Instead, I felt nothing but a quiet sadness. "I'm sorry she's sick," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But you only call me when you need something. That's not love. That's convenience." A long silence stretched between us. "We made mistakes," he finally admitted. "But she's still your mother." I took a breath. "I know, and despite everything, I don't want her to suffer." I agreed to cover her medical bills, but not for them. I did it for myself, to release the burden of their neglect and to prove to myself that I was better than the way they had treated me. But I made one thing clear. "I'll pay for the treatment," I said, my voice unwavering. "But I'm done chasing your love. I won't let you hurt me again." For once, my father didn't argue. "Thank you," he said quietly before ending the call. When I hung up, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. I had broken free from their hold, not through anger or revenge, but by reclaiming my power. In the weeks that followed, I continued to thrive. My work flourished, my friendships deepened, and for the first time, I felt whole without their approval. Emily and I rebuilt a fragile but genuine relationship. She wasn't perfect, but she was trying, and that mattered more than empty words. And my parents? They would always regret choosing my brother over me, but I no longer needed their love to know my worth. I was enough. Always had been. Always would be. A few months passed after that phone call with my father. True to my word, I paid for my mother's treatment without hesitation. I sent the money directly to the hospital, ensuring there was no room for manipulation or excuses. I didn't do it for them. I did it because I refused to let their actions turn me into someone cold and heartless. But something shifted inside me after that conversation. It felt like closing a door I had been leaving open for far too long. For years, I had hoped they would see me, love me, and choose me. But now I understood the truth. I couldn't make them value me, and I wasn't going to exhaust myself trying anymore. My life, for the first time, became about me. I started investing more time in myself, physically, emotionally, and professionally. I joined a gym, not to punish my body, but to strengthen it. I went to therapy, peeling back the layers of pain and rejection I had carried since childhood. My therapist once told me, "Healing isn't about fixing what's broken, it's about realizing you were whole all along." Those words stayed with me. At work, I thrived. My ideas became bolder, my confidence sharper. The same bosses who once overlooked me were now seeking my input. I had earned my place, and no one, not my parents, not my sister, could take that away. Emily and I kept working together on the joint project, and slowly, our relationship became something I never thought possible. Civil, even warm. She called occasionally, nothing too deep, but the effort was there. It felt strange to let her in again, even a little. But maybe I wasn't the only one trying to heal. One day, while sorting through emails, I saw an invitation that made me pause. It was for a high-profile leadership summit, an opportunity to present my work in front of industry giants. This wasn't just any event. This was the kind of platform that could elevate my career to new heights, and I had been personally invited to speak. I felt a surge of pride. All the late nights, the tears, the pain, they had led to this. For the first time, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter or the shadow behind her golden sibling. I was Linda, independent, successful, and unstoppable. But life, as I had learned, never stays quiet for long. A week before the summit, I received another phone call, this time from my mother. Her voice was weak, thinner than I remembered. "Linda," she began softly, "I wanted to thank you for helping with the medical bills. I know we've hurt you." I stayed silent, unsure if I could trust her words. "Your father doesn't say it, but he's proud of you," she continued. "We both are. I know we made mistakes. I wish we had done things differently." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the apology I had waited for my entire life. Maybe they were finally ready to see me. But then she said the words that shattered that illusion. "Your brother is struggling with his business," she sighed. "He could really use your help. Maybe you could lend him some money. You're doing so well after all." I felt my heart harden. Of course. Even now, their concern wasn't truly for me. It was for him. I took a breath, keeping my voice steady. "I'm sorry he's struggling," I said, the edge of exhaustion lacing my words. "But I'm not responsible for fixing his mistakes. I've done enough." There was a long silence on the other end. When she finally spoke again, her tone was colder. "We're still your family, Linda." I laughed softly, a bitter sound even to my own ears. Funny. I used to think family meant love and support, not just showing up when you need something. I didn't mean to upset you, she murmured, but the warmth from earlier was gone. I have to go, I said, feeling the familiar ache creep into my chest. Take care. I hung up before she could respond. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I let myself cry. Not for them, but for the girl I used to be. The girl who spent her whole life begging to be loved. I mourned for her, and as the tears fell, I promised myself she would never have to beg again. The day of the summit arrived, and I stood before an audience of powerful, influential leaders. My hands trembled slightly as I stepped up to the podium, but as I began to speak, the fear melted away. I shared my story, not the pain, but the lessons I had learned. I spoke about resilience, about finding value in yourself when the world refuses to see you. My voice rang strong and steady, and by the time I finished, the applause was thunderous. When I stepped off the stage, I spotted Rachel beaming at me from the crowd. She hugged me tightly. "You did it, Linda," she whispered. "You showed them all." In that moment, I realized I didn't need my parents' validation anymore. I had built a life I was proud of, a life where I was finally enough, all on my own. A week after the summit, I received a letter in the mail. At first, I assumed it was another bill or work correspondence, but the handwriting on the envelope made me pause. It was from my father. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single page. His words were short, but they hit me harder than any speech ever could. "Linda, I'm sorry for every time we made you feel less than. You deserved better. You always did. I wish I had told you sooner, but I am proud of the woman you've become. Take care of yourself. Dad." Tears filled my eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase the years of neglect. But it was something. And maybe that was enough. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. I had already found my peace. In the months that followed, I continued building the life I had always deserved. My career flourished, new friendships blossomed, and I learned how to love myself without conditions. As for my parents, they would always live with the weight of their regrets. But their regrets were no longer my burden to carry. I was free. Finally, beautifully free. In the months that followed the leadership summit, life took on a rhythm I had never known before, a rhythm where I was no longer weighed down by the constant ache for my family's approval. I poured myself into my career, and the rewards came swiftly. Promotions, partnerships, and new opportunities flooded my inbox, and for the first time, I felt unstoppable. I no longer flinched when my phone rang, fearing it was another call from my parents asking for help, or worse, offering their conditional affection. I had drawn a boundary, and I stood by it. My days were filled with purpose, and my nights were filled with peace. Rachel remained my biggest supporter, and our friendship only deepened. We celebrated milestones together, my professional successes, her engagement, and every small victory that felt like reclaiming pieces of the girl I had lost over the years. With every passing day, I became more comfortable in the life I had built, a life where I didn't have to prove my worth to anyone. But despite my newfound strength, some wounds ran deeper than others. One evening, while I was working late, I received an unexpected message from Emily. It was simple, just a photo of us as children. In the picture, I was around 6 years old, holding her hand tightly as she grinned at the camera. Underneath the photo, her message read, "I miss this. Do you?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Did I? A part of me wanted to ignore the message, to protect the peace I had finally found. But another part of me, the part that had once loved my sister unconditionally, ached to respond. I took a deep breath and replied, "Sometimes. But things are different now, Emily. I'm different." Her reply came almost immediately. "I know, I want to understand, if you'll let me." I wasn't sure if I was ready to let her in again, but something in her words felt genuine. For so long, I had seen her as my rival, the golden child who could do no wrong. But maybe she was just another product of the same broken family. Maybe we both deserved a chance to heal. We started small. Coffee dates that were tentative and careful, filled with conversations that tiptoed around old wounds. But as the weeks passed, we began to speak more openly. She told me how exhausting it had been to carry the weight of our parents' expectations, how much pressure she felt to be perfect. "I was jealous of you, you know," she admitted one evening as we sat in a quiet cafe. I laughed softly, the idea seeming ridiculous. "Of me? Why?" "Because you were free," she said, her voice soft but sure. "They never pressured you the way they did me. I spent my whole life trying not to disappoint them. You got to be yourself." I had never thought of it that way. To me, she had always been the chosen the one they loved, the one they wanted. But maybe, in some twisted way, we had both been trapped by their expectations, just in different cages. Our relationship didn't transform overnight, but brick by brick, we rebuilt something that resembled sisterhood. And in doing so, I realized something I had never fully understood. I didn't need to carry the bitterness anymore. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing. It meant freeing myself from their hold. But forgiveness, true forgiveness, was a different battle. A few months after reconnecting with Emily, I received another letter from my father. This time, it wasn't a short note. It was pages long, filled with memories, regrets, and the kind of raw honesty I had once believed he was incapable of. He told me about his own childhood, how his father had treated him as an afterthought while his brother received all the praise, how he had promised himself he would never repeat that cycle, only to fall into the same trap with his own children. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he wrote. "I just want you to know I see you now, and I am so, so sorry it took me this long." I cried reading his words, not because they erased the pain, but because they acknowledged it. For years I had felt invisible, but here, in black ink on white paper, was proof that I had been seen. I didn't call him right away. I wasn't sure I could, but I started to soften, not for them, but for me. One evening, months later, my phone rang. When I saw my father's name on the screen, I hesitated before answering. His voice trembled on the other end. "Linda, I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for helping your mother, for—" He paused, his breath shaky. "For not giving up on us entirely." For the first time, I didn't feel anger toward him, just a quiet sadness for what could have been, and a hope for what still might be. "I'm doing well, Dad," I said softly, "and I hope you are too." It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. But it was a beginning. Over time, my parents' hold on me loosened. Their guilt and regrets would always be theirs to bear. But I no longer let their failures define me. I was Linda, whole, powerful, and free. And I had finally chosen myself. By the time I stood on the balcony of my apartment that summer evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something profound. I wasn't waiting for their love anymore. I wasn't craving their approval. I was enough, just as I was. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. In the weeks following my father's unexpected call, I felt a strange mix of emotions: hope, fear, and a cautious kind of curiosity. I wasn't naive enough to believe everything could be healed with one conversation, but something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was his apology, or maybe it was simply that I was no longer that desperate, broken girl searching for scraps of affection. Either way, I felt lighter, stronger. Life continued moving forward. My career blossomed in ways I had only dreamed of. I led projects that made national headlines, expanded my network, and eventually, I was offered a senior leadership position, a job that once felt unreachable. I took it, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I had earned it. Every late night, every tear, every moment of doubt had led me here. Rachel and I remained inseparable. She was preparing for her wedding, and I became deeply involved in the planning. Somewhere between dress fittings and cake tastings, I realized that I had built a family for myself, one not defined by blood, but by choice. And yet, despite the stability I had found, there was a lingering ache whenever I thought about my parents. I didn't miss the pain they had caused, but I missed the idea of family, the laughter around the dinner table, the warmth of being someone's priority. No matter how much I tried to bury it, that longing still lived inside me. One afternoon, as I sorted through old boxes in my closet, I found a dusty envelope tucked between my childhood journals. My heart skipped when I recognized my mother's handwriting. I had forgotten about this letter, one she had written on my 18th birthday. I sat on the floor and carefully opened it, unfolding the delicate paper. Linda, I know things have never been easy between us. I wish I knew how to bridge the gap that seems to grow wider every year. I see your strength, your independence, and sometimes I wonder if you even need us. But I want you to know, we love you. In our flawed, imperfect way, we love you. Happy birthday, my girl. I hope you always find your way. Tears welled in my eyes as I read her words. It was the first time I had felt a sliver of her vulnerability. All these years, I had believed she never cared, but maybe she had just never known how to show it. For days, I wrestled with the letter. Was it enough to erase years of neglect? Could a few sentences on a fragile piece of paper heal the wounds I had carried for so long? I didn't know. But something in me wasn't ready to let go entirely. A week later, I did something that would have been unthinkable months ago. I called my mother. When she answered, her voice was hesitant, almost disbelieving. "Linda?" "Hi, Mom," I said quietly. I found your letter, the one from my 18th birthday." Silence stretched between us. Then her voice softened. "I didn't think you ever read it." "I did," I admitted. "I found it recently, and I've been thinking about you and Dad." She let out a shaky breath. "We think about you too. Every day." Hearing those words unlocked something deep inside me, a crack in the wall I had built to protect myself. For so long, I had wanted them to acknowledge the pain they caused, to understand how deeply their actions had cut me. Maybe they never fully would. But this was a start. Our conversation that night lasted over an hour. It wasn't perfect, and we didn't resolve everything. But for the first time, I felt like we were trying. Both of us. Over the following months, I allowed small pieces of reconciliation to bloom. My parents and I began speaking more regularly. There were still awkward silences and moments when their words stung more than they should. But there was also progress. Little by little, the ice between us began to thaw. One day, my father called me with unexpected news. "Your mother and I, we've been thinking about everything," he said slowly. "And we want to make things right, Linda. We want to come visit. If you'll have us." I should have been thrilled. This was what I had wanted for years, for them to see me, to make the effort. But instead, I felt fear curl in my stomach. Could I trust them not to hurt me again? Was it worth risking the peace I had worked so hard to build? Still, despite my hesitation, I agreed. When they arrived a week later, it felt surreal to see them standing outside my apartment. My mother's face was etched with worry, and my father, once so distant, looked older, almost fragile. For a moment, I wanted to retreat into the safety of the walls I had built around my heart, but I didn't. I invited them inside. The visit was both strange and familiar. We tiptoed around certain topics, but found comfort in others. My mother admired the photographs of my achievements. My father, who had once dismissed my ambitions, sat quietly as I told him about my work. For the first time, I didn't try to impress them. I simply let them see me as I was. As the night wore on, my mother reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything. We should have been better." Her words cracked something open inside me. I didn't know if their apology could undo the years of hurt, but maybe it wasn't about undoing it. Maybe it was about deciding to stop carrying it. When they left the next morning, I didn't feel empty. I felt lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had chosen to let go of the bitterness. In the weeks that followed, we kept in touch. Slowly, I allowed them into my life, not fully, but enough. And in doing so, I realized something profound. Their failures as parents didn't define my worth. I had built a life that was full and meaningful, with or without their approval. One evening, Rachel and I sat on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the city skyline. She turned to me with a smile. "You did it, Linda," she said softly. "You chose yourself." And she was right. For so long, I had craved their love, their validation. But in choosing to love myself first, I had freed myself from their shadow. I didn't know what the future held with my parents, whether we would ever truly be close. But I did know this. I was no longer the girl desperate to be chosen. I had chosen myself, and that was enough. A few months after my parents' visit, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Our conversations, once strained and sporadic, became more regular. My mother would call every few weeks, sometimes with no reason at all, just to check in. My father, though still guarded in his own way, sent occasional texts asking about my work or simply wishing me a good day. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but something had undeniably shifted. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a place, however small, in their lives again. But even as those wounds began to heal, I couldn't forget the years I spent alone. The ache of their rejection, the nights I cried myself to sleep while they doted on my brother, the way they left me behind when I needed them most. It was all still there, lingering beneath the surface. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a switch I could flip. It was a slow, ongoing process, one I wasn't always sure I was capable of completing. During one of our phone calls, my mother mentioned that my brother, Eric, had moved back home after struggling to hold down a job. The golden child, the one who could do no wrong, was floundering. A bitter part of me wanted to feel satisfaction. After all, they had invested so much in him while casting me aside. And yet when I thought about him, I didn't feel triumph. I felt empty. I hadn't spoken to Eric in years. After my accident, he never called or visited. The last memory I had of him was a casual, almost indifferent wave when my parents loaded their bags for their Italy trip. It was easier to imagine he didn't care, because if he did, the pain of his silence would have been unbearable. One evening, as I curled up on my couch with a cup of tea, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. My heart stuttered when I read the first line. "Hey, Linda? It's Eric. Can we talk?" For a long moment, I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. My first instinct was to ignore it. After everything, what right did he have to reach out now? But something, curiosity maybe, pushed me to respond. "What do you want?" His reply was almost immediate. "I know I've been a terrible brother, but I need to explain myself. Please." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. A part of me wanted answers. The other part wanted to know if he even had them. We met at a small cafe downtown. I arrived early, my heart pounding as I watched the door. When he finally walked in, I barely recognized him. The confident, carefree brother I remembered was gone. In his place stood a man who looked worn down, his once bright smile dulled, his shoulders slumped. "Hey," he said quietly, sliding into the seat across from me. I nodded stiffly, unsure how to begin. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," he started, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I needed to see you, Linda. I owe you an apology, an explanation." I folded my arms. "Why now?" His face twisted with guilt. "Because I can't stop thinking about how badly I messed up. About how I let you." Eric's words hung heavy between us. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, of him admitting his wrongs, of finally understanding why he had abandoned me when I needed him the most. But now that he was here, sitting across from me, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to hear his explanation. What excuse could possibly justify the years of silence and neglect? He took a shaky breath, his fingers nervously tapping against the edge of the table. "I know I was a terrible brother, Linda," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "And you have every right to hate me. But there are things you don't know, things I should have told you a long time ago." I stayed quiet, waiting. If he wanted me to understand, he would have to earn my patience. "I was jealous of you," he admitted, the words surprising me. "You always seemed so strong, so independent. No matter what life threw at you, you handled it. And Mom and Dad, they always worried about me because I wasn't like you. I thought if I kept my head down and followed their rules, maybe I'd finally be enough for them. And when you had your accident..." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I should have been there, but instead, I was too busy being the perfect son they wanted me to be." His confession stirred something in me. All these years, I had painted him as the golden child, untouchable, favored, and adored. I never considered that the pedestal our parents put him on felt more like a cage to him. "That doesn't explain why you left me behind," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I was lying in a hospital bed while you were off living your life. How could you just forget about me?" Eric's eyes clouded with shame. "I didn't forget. I tried to visit, more than once. But Mom and Dad, they told me you didn't want to see me. They said you were angry, that I would just make things worse. And I believed them because I was scared. I was scared to face you and admit how much I had failed you. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I had spent years convincing myself that Eric didn't care, that he had chosen to walk away. But to hear that our own parents had stood in the way of our relationship, It cut deeper than I thought possible. They lied to you? My voice trembled. He nodded slowly. I didn't realize how much until a few months ago. After I lost my job and moved back home, I started to see the cracks in everything they told me. They still talk about you like you're some kind of disappointment. But I know better now. I know how strong you are. And I know how badly I hurt you. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat, fighting the storm of emotions threatening to break free. Part of me wanted to cling to my anger. It was easier to hate him than to admit how much I had missed him. But another part, a quieter and more vulnerable part, wanted to believe that this was real, that he was truly sorry. I spent so many nights wondering why you didn't care, I confessed, my voice softening. When I needed you the most, I felt completely alone. Do you know how much that hurt? I do, he said, his voice heavy with regret. And I'll never forgive myself for letting you go through that alone. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the cafe faded into the background as we sat there, years of pain and misunderstandings resting between us. I wanted to hold on to my bitterness, to protect myself from being hurt again. But deep down, I knew that wasn't what I really wanted. I don't know if I can forgive you, I admitted honestly. Not yet. Eric nodded, his expression solemn. I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight. I want to try. I want to be your brother again if you'll let me. His words cracked something open inside me. I had spent so long building walls around my heart. But in that moment, I realized how tired I was of carrying all that anger. I missed having a family, missed having someone who knew me before everything fell apart. I don't know how to trust you again, I said quietly. But maybe we can start small. A faint smile tugged at his lips. I'll take whatever you're willing to give. Over the next few months, Eric kept his promise. He called regularly, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to share funny stories from his day. It was awkward at first, tentative and fragile. But slowly, the walls between us began to crumble. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a sibling again. But my relationship with my parents remained strained. Despite their attempts to reach out, I struggled to move past the years of neglect. I knew they wanted to sweep everything under the rug, to pretend that the pain they caused didn't matter. But I wasn't ready to give them that easy forgiveness. One evening, while I was cleaning my apartment, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. We're having a family dinner this Sunday. Will you come? I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect myself from the inevitable disappointment. But another part, the part that still longed for some version of a family, wanted to go. After several minutes of internal debate, I typed a simple response. I'll think about it. When Sunday arrived, I stood outside my parents' house, my stomach twisting with anxiety. It had been years since I set foot inside, and every memory came flooding back, every cutting remark, every moment I felt invisible. Eric opened the door before I could knock. Hey, he said, his voice warm. I'm glad you came. I managed a small smile. I almost didn't. I know, he said softly. But you did, and that matters. Inside, my parents greeted me with hesitant smiles. The house looked the same, pristine and perfect, but beneath the surface, everything felt different. There was no more illusion of a perfect family. We were broken, and maybe we always had been. Dinner was awkward at first, the conversation stilted and polite. My mother asked about my job, while my father offered stiff comments about the weather. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. For the first time, they listened, really listened to my experiences. And for the first time, I allowed myself to speak honestly. "I'm not here to pretend everything is fine," I said, my voice steady. "You hurt me, and it's going to take time for me to trust you again." My father looked down, guilt etched across his face. My mother reached for my hand, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "We know, Linda," she whispered, "and we're sorry. We just want a chance to make things right." I didn't know if we could ever be the family I once hoped for. But maybe, just maybe, we could build something new, a fragile, imperfect version of love that didn't erase the past, but didn't let it define us either. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The following months were a slow, delicate balancing act. My relationship with Eric continued to heal step by step. He didn't push for forgiveness or expect things to be perfect overnight. Instead, he showed up, consistently and patiently. Some days, I still felt the sting of abandonment. Other days, I let myself believe in the possibility of a better future. It wasn't easy to let go of the years of pain, but with every call, every visit, Eric chipped away at the resentment I had held onto for so long. As for my parents, things were more complicated. After the family dinner, I kept my boundaries firm. I didn't let them pretend everything was fine, and I didn't let them sweep the past under the rug. I still carried the memories of my darkest days, how they left me to fend for myself when I needed them the most. But I also realized something else. I didn't want to carry that bitterness forever. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was my mother. I hesitated before answering, still unsure whether I was ready to let her in completely. "Hi, Mom," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Linda," she said softly, her tone unfamiliar, gentle, even vulnerable. "I know you're probably busy, but I was wondering if we could talk." I sighed quietly. "What is it?" "I've been thinking a lot about the past," she began, her voice unsteady. "And I know I can't change what we did, but I need you to know that I regret it, deeply. I thought pushing you aside would make things easier for everyone, but all it did was break our family apart. And that's on us, not you." Her words caught me off guard. For years I had dreamed of hearing an apology like this, raw, honest, without excuses. And yet, hearing it now didn't magically erase the pain. Nothing could. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "But it's going to take time for me to trust you again." "I understand," she said quickly. I don't want to lose you, Linda, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix things. If you'll let me." Her vulnerability pierced through the walls I had spent years building. I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive her, or my father. But in that moment, I realized I wanted to try. Not for them, but for myself. "I'm not ready to forget everything," I admitted. "But maybe we can start again." Slowly. A soft, relieved sob escaped her. "That's all I want." As I hung up the phone, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to lift. Maybe reconciliation wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward despite it. Months turned into a year, and little by little, the fractures in our family began to heal. Eric became a constant presence in my life, proving through actions, not just words, that he wanted to be my brother again. We laughed about childhood memories, leaned on each other during tough days, and built a bond stronger than we'd ever had before. My parents, too, made genuine efforts. They didn't try to force their way back into my life, but instead respected the pace I set. My mother called, just to check in without prying. My father, once cold and distant, showed small gestures of care. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One day, after finishing a long shift at the clinic, I found an envelope waiting for me in my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father, a man who had never been good with words. Linda, I know an apology can't undo the years of pain we caused you, but I need you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become. You built a life for yourself without our help, when we should have been your greatest support. I see that now, and I regret every moment we weren't there. If you'll let me, I want to be there for you from now on. I love you. Dad. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter carefully. I had spent so many years believing that I was invisible to my own family, discarded in favor of my brother. But now, for the first time, I felt seen, and I realized something else. I wasn't broken because of them. I was whole because of me. I had survived their neglect. I had rebuilt my life from nothing. And while their regrets couldn't undo the past, I no longer needed their validation to feel worthy. I chose to let them in, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. A year later, on a warm summer afternoon, I sat in my backyard, watching as Eric played with his young daughter. My parents sat nearby, laughing softly as they shared stories from their own childhoods. It was a scene I never thought I'd have. A family, imperfect but whole in its own way. I wasn't the same broken girl they had once abandoned. I was stronger, wiser, and finally free from the pain they had inflicted. And while the scars would always remain, they no longer defined me. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, people could change. And maybe, just maybe, love, no matter how messy, was worth giving a second chance. For years, my parents had chosen my brother over me. But now, every day, they lived with the knowledge that I had built a life they could never take away. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that I was more than enough.